My name is Jordan Ellis. I'm 34 years old, a freelance graphic designer living quietly in a cozy two-bedroom apartment I've rented for the last 7 years. It's not extravagant, but it's mine, my peace, my sanctuary. I've never asked my parents for much, and since going independent, I've paid my rent, my bills, and kept to myself. Family, though, family has always been complicated. I'm the oldest. My sister, Ava, is 5 years younger, expecting her first baby, and for reasons I've learned not to question out loud, our parents have always treated her like delicate royalty. Me? I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need much. It started on a Thursday. I was working on a deadline when I heard the knock. Not the soft kind. This was sharp, almost impatient. I opened the door and saw 2 delivery men wheeling in a large baby crib box, confused. I told them there had to be a mistake, but they read back my address, my unit number, and my name. Sort of. My first name was scribbled in ink over a shipping label that originally had Ava's. That was the first red flag. Then came the second, a moving truck pulling into the lot, with my father at the wheel. He stepped out like he was doing me a favor. "We're helping you move to that little studio by Maple," he said, like it was already agreed upon. My mother was behind him, clutching a folder of apartment listings I'd never seen. My heart thudded against my chest. I hadn't asked to move. No one discussed anything with me. But there they were, boxes, tape and plastic bins, ready to gut my apartment like a scheduled eviction. I stood frozen, staring at my name half erased on a baby furniture box that didn't belong to me. I asked my mother why they were doing this. Her response? "It's just temporary, Jordan. Ava needs the space. You can work anywhere, right? You're always saying your work is flexible." That word, flexible, burned, as if independence means disposability, as if having boundaries is negotiable when someone else is more convenient to accommodate. I watched as my father started unplugging my lamp, casually tossing my books into a bin. Like this wasn't my home, just a placeholder they were reclaiming.
I didn't scream.
I didn't argue. I walked into the hallway, shut the door gently behind me, and dialed the building's front desk. I asked if there was a permit for the move. There wasn't. Then I called the non-emergency police line and explained that an unauthorized group of people, yes, my family, were trying to remove me from my legal residence. It sounded dramatic, even to me, but it was also the truth. And I wasn't going to be erased with kindness and a cardboard box. As I stood on the sidewalk watching the officer approach my parents and gently ask them to step aside from the building's entrance, I saw my mother's face twist in disbelief. My father stared at me like I had betrayed them, but what neither of them realized was that the real betrayal had already happened, and it wasn't mine. I was just finally responding to it. They always assumed I'd say yes, that I'd fold quietly, pack my things, and make room for the greater need. That's the role I've played my entire life. The peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who adjusted. I think my parents convinced themselves that since I didn't cry loudly or complain openly, I didn't feel the way Ava did. She wore her emotions like jewelry, loud, visible, admired. I wore mine like armor, heavy but hidden. And for years that worked, until it didn't. As the officer escorted them out and informed them they couldn't enter without my consent, my father glanced back at me, not angry, but disappointed. That subtle, piercing kind of disappointment that says, "How could you do this to us?" It struck me how deep the conditioning ran. It wasn't just entitlement, it was emotional investment. They believed they were doing what was best, that their invasion was kindness, that my sacrifice should be automatic. But I had finally chosen myself, and that to them was betrayal. I sat alone that evening in the half-unpacked living room. A bin labeled Jordan's books sat open like a wound. A picture frame of me from college had been carelessly tossed on top of a pile of baby clothes that weren't mine. I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't angry. I was tired of being useful instead of loved. Chosen last, yet expected first. My whole life I thought being strong meant being selfless. But now I saw it clearly. Sometimes being strong means saying no, even to the people who raised you. What hurt more than the act itself was the realization that they had planned this behind my back. My mother had been visiting more frequently the past few weeks, offering to help clean, asking about my schedule. I thought she was just being kind. In reality, she was scoping out what needed packing. Ava's furniture didn't end up at my place by mistake. It had been rerouted, redirected. I was never consulted, just calculated. And yet, I didn't block their numbers. I didn't send angry messages or demand apologies. I said nothing. My silence was not revenge, it was reflection. I needed to understand how deep this pattern went, how far back the imbalance began. It wasn't about one crib or one apartment. It was about a lifetime of being the backup plan, the invisible son who made life easier by not needing too much. That night, I wrote one sentence in my journal. You don't owe your peace to those who gamble it away. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew this. I would not be moved, not by guilt, not by pressure, and certainly not by a delivery that wasn't mine. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started looking through old emails and documents, not out of paranoia, but out of curiosity. Something in me felt unsettled, like I'd missed something obvious. I wasn't wrong. As I searched, I found a forwarded email chain from my mother, buried in an old shared folder, one I'd set up years ago to help her with tech issues. She must have forgotten it still synced. The subject read, Ava's nursery measurements. Jay's place is perfect. My chest tightened. There it was, in her own words. Proof that this had been plotted well before Ava even began showing. The email thread was months old. My parents, my sister, and even Ava's husband had been discussing layouts, furniture sizes, how Jordan doesn't really use that second room anyway. I stared at the screen, blinking, feeling like a ghost, reading conversations about a life he's still occupied. They had assigned me out of my own home without ever speaking to me. They were designing Ava's comfort on the foundation of my quiet compliance, but that version of me was gone. I didn't respond to the emails. I didn't confront them. Instead, I called my landlord. I explained what had happened and requested that my lease be formally renewed early, and that a written notice be placed on file stating that no other individuals, including family, had permission to act on my behalf. The landlord, sympathetic but firm, agreed. I had one more request. I asked him to install a security camera outside my unit, just in case, not out of fear, but preparation. Next, I quietly updated all my delivery addresses, changed access permissions on every account I'd ever shared with family, even the ones I'd long forgotten. It took hours, but each click was a reclaiming of space, of self, of trust. I didn't send out angry warnings or messages to let them know. I simply cut the access, the way a surgeon removes something decaying before it spreads. And then, with steady hands, I started building something new. I also did something small but symbolic. I ordered a crib. Not for me, but for a charity that supports single mothers in transitional housing. I sent it in Ava's name, with no return address. A quiet message, invisible to them, but loud to my own spirit. What they tried to take from me, I'll turn into generosity, but not for their benefit. In stillness, I had begun my quiet plan, not to retaliate, but to rebuild. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about balance. The next move would not be dramatic. it would be decisive. I would not fight them. I would simply outgrow the space they kept trying to shrink me into. A week passed in silence. Not a single call from my parents, no check-ins, no let's talk. It was the first time in years that I felt a strange kind of freedom, a space where my life didn't orbit around emotional negotiation. I expected their silence to be punishment. Instead, it was peace, the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts again. The kind that tells you were never crazy for needing boundaries, just shamed for daring to draw them. Then came a call from Ava's husband. I didn't pick up, but his voicemail was clipped with stress. He sounded confused, asking if I knew anything about the lease mix-up or why the landlord had refused the nursery drop-off. His tone was different this time, less smug, more frantic. I listened to it twice. It was working. The house of assumptions they built was starting to crumble, not because I attacked it, but because I stepped away from it. That's the thing about weak foundations. They collapse under their own weight when no one holds them up. I stayed silent. I went about my days. I designed. I slept. I listened to jazz in the evenings, like the world wasn't coming undone, across the city in my parents' living room. But beneath that stillness, I knew something was shifting. The control they thought they had over me was gone, and the panic was setting in. The fact that I didn't retaliate made it worse for them, because nothing makes a manipulator feel more powerless than the absence of a reaction. My mother eventually called. This time, she sounded fragile. She opened with, "Jordan, I just want to talk. Can we please come over?" I paused before replying. Then I said calmly, "I'd prefer we talk somewhere neutral, a cafe. Saturday afternoon." Her voice tightened. "You don't want us in your home?" I answered. "I want my home to feel like home, not a negotiation table." That was the last thing I said before I hung up. Saturday came. They arrived late. They looked smaller somehow, tired, off balance. My father couldn't meet my eyes at first. My mother tried to explain it all away. "We thought we were helping. We just assumed you'd be okay." Ava, of course, didn't show. I sat still and let them speak. Every word was lined with unspoken expectation that I would forgive, forget, and fold again. But I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod. I didn't absorb the blame like I used to. Then my father asked, "What do you want, Jordan?" I looked at him for a long moment and answered, "I want you to understand that I am not your backup plan. I am not a placeholder for someone else's comfort." His mouth opened, then closed. Nothing came out, and for the first time, I saw it. Not anger, not guilt, but recognition. Something had finally registered. They were no longer at the center of my decisions, and that terrified them. That cafe meeting didn't end with hugs or healing. It ended with silence, awkward, heavy, necessary. They left unsure of what came next, and for once I didn't offer them a path forward. I wasn't cruel. I just didn't rescue them from the discomfort of their choices. That was new for all of us. My mother looked back once before they walked out, her eyes glossy with something between confusion and grief. Maybe she was realizing that I wasn't coming back to the version of me they preferred, the agreeable son who absorbed their needs like sponge water. That version was buried respectfully, without ceremony. In the following days, they tried soft strategies. My aunt called, nudging me to make peace with your folks. Ava texted a sonogram photo with a single heart emoji. I responded politely, but distantly. It wasn't anger that held me back. It was the clarity that emotional manipulation often wears the costume of reconciliation. I wasn't rejecting my family. I was rejecting the terms they had always set. If I was going to have a relationship with them again, it would be by invitation, not expectation. Meanwhile, a small detail gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. Ava's building wouldn't allow furniture deliveries without a tenant's signature, and she, 8 months pregnant and overwhelmed, had to manage every rescheduled drop-off on her own. The studio they had picked out for me, it had already been leased to someone else. The crib they tried to plant in my living room was eventually donated, without fanfare, to the charity I had sent one 2 weeks before. What they meant for control was slowly turning into chaos. Not because I fought, but because I stopped enabling. A family system built on silent sacrifices doesn't know how to breathe when one person stops bleeding for everyone else. I had stopped, and the air around them had changed. I heard from a mutual friend that my mother had broken down in tears during brunch, saying she just didn't understand what went wrong with Jordan. I smiled gently when I heard that. Because it wasn't about what went wrong, it was about what I finally made right for myself. I didn't gloat, I didn't share the screenshots or receipts. I didn't explain my version of events to the extended family. I didn't need to, my absence was explanation enough. My refusal to be manipulated was louder than any defense I could give. The narrative they had crafted, the dutiful son making way for his glowing sister, had shattered, and in its place stood a man who had quietly taken his power back. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic scene, just a slow unraveling of a dynamic that had gone unquestioned for too long. And now, in the stillness of my reclaimed home, I felt it for the first time in years. Freedom not from my family, but from the role they had written for me without permission. I didn't change the locks out of fear. I changed them to mark a turning point, a symbol, a way of saying, this door, this life, is no longer revolving for anyone else's convenience. My apartment felt different now, not because the layout had changed, but because the energy had every object, every photo, every book was exactly where I wanted it. No one else's hands had touched them. It was the first time in my adult life that I felt completely unobserved, unobligated, just free. Months passed. Ava gave birth to a healthy baby boy. I sent a card, no gifts, no visit. Not out of bitterness, but to protect the quiet, hard-earned balance I'd created. My parents never pushed again. We spoke occasionally, short, formal conversations about weather and groceries. It was distant, yes, but it was honest. The days of pretending everything was fine while resentment brewed underneath were over. I had chosen peace, and peace sometimes means space. It's strange how clarity doesn't come with a loud epiphany. It comes in still moments, like doing laundry in your own place and knowing no one can take it from you. Or making dinner without tiptoeing around guilt. Or sleeping in without wondering who you've disappointed by not showing up. That's what revenge looked like in my story. Not a fiery outburst, but a calm, decisive return to myself. I didn't ruin their lives. I simply removed myself from their script. I've learned that betrayal doesn't always come with cruelty. Sometimes it comes disguised as help, as love, as we just want what's best. But when their version of what's best for you erases you, it's not love, it's control. And the most powerful thing you can ever do is simply not allow it. One afternoon, I stood in the second bedroom, the one they wanted to give away, and smiled. It now held a small art table, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a reading chair that caught the afternoon sun perfectly. It wasn't a nursery, it was mine, and every inch of it existed because I decided I was worth more than polite sacrifice. Healing didn't come in the way I thought it would. I didn't wake up one day feeling whole. It came slowly, like water rising in a glass, barely noticeable until one day you look down and realize you're not empty anymore. I started spending my mornings on the balcony with tea and quiet. No phone, no news, just breath and blue sky. It was then I realized how long I had lived in reaction, always preparing for the next emotional obligation. Now, there was none. I also started therapy, quietly. No big revelation, no announcement. Just me, once a week, sitting in a chair across from someone who asked questions no one had ever bothered to ask. "When did you first learn that your needs came second?" she said once. I didn't answer that day, but I thought about it for weeks. And the answer, when it came, wasn't a moment. It was a lifetime. I'd grown up equating love with usefulness, that if I wasn't needed, I wasn't wanted. So I became the quiet one, the strong one, the giver. And somewhere along the way, I vanished. But now, I was reappearing, not loudly but steadily. I started saying no to things that drained me. I stopped answering calls immediately. I even unsubscribed from family group chats that buzzed constantly with updates about Ava's baby. It wasn't out of spite, it was self-preservation. I wasn't disappearing. I was choosing presence with myself. And in doing so, I realized something else. Peace isn't passive. It's a decision you make every day to protect what you've built. I took on new clients too, higher paying, more aligned with my creative voice. My work became sharper, bolder. I found my rhythm again, without distraction, without resentment simmering under the surface. And the irony, my career flourished. The moment I stopped bending myself to meet everyone else's demands. Turns out, clarity makes you more competent. One night I passed by my hallway mirror and didn't flinch. That may not sound like much, but to someone who has spent years unsure of their own reflection, it meant everything. I stood there for a long moment, hand resting on the doorframe, and said softly, "I see you," not to check my appearance, but to acknowledge the man I'd become, the one who survived quiet betrayal and chose something louder: boundaries. Because healing, I've learned, isn't about getting back to who you were. It's about becoming the version of yourself who no longer needs permission to exist fully. The silence I created didn't go unnoticed. It just took them a while to feel it. At first, my family mistook it for distance, then for defiance. But as the months passed and I remained calm, composed and unavailable, they began to recognize it for what it was, a boundary they couldn't breach. My absence didn't scream, it whispered truth, and in that quiet space their patterns no longer had a stage to perform on. My mother was the first to try to reach across the new boundary. She sent a long message one evening, a real one, not the polite texts with emojis. In it she asked me if I was still angry, but I wasn't. I hadn't been for a long time. What I felt now was peace, and sometimes peace feels like cold distance to people who only knew you through your availability. I didn't respond right away. I waited 2 days before replying with a sentence that said everything. "I'm not angry. I'm just not abandoning myself anymore." She didn't reply after that, but I know she read it. Twice. That was enough. I didn't send it to hurt her. I sent it because I needed her to understand that this wasn't punishment. It was a choice, one that I'd make again. Ava, on the other hand, never reached out. I think deep down she knew that what they did crossed a line, knew that my silence was a mirror she couldn't look into. She had inherited the crown of being favored, but it came at a cost, and now that cost had become visible. In the absence of my compliance, things in their world shifted. I heard from a cousin that my father was more withdrawn, that my parents were less involved with Ava's child than anyone expected. Without me as the emotional buffer, their roles became heavier to carry. I wasn't happy about it, but I wasn't guilty either. For once I wasn't carrying a weight that didn't belong to me, and that felt like justice. And through it all, I never once raised my voice, never sent a long, punishing message, never aired my pain for social validation. I simply walked away from the performance and let the empty stage speak louder than I ever could. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing, because silence isn't the absence of emotion, it's the presence of self-respect. They may never say the words I once longed to hear. I'm sorry, you deserved better. But I've stopped waiting, because I've already told myself those words. And I believe them. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon when I realized my story had shifted from survival to creation. I wasn't just maintaining boundaries anymore. I was building something real, something lasting. I started mentoring a few younger designers, creatives, just starting out in the world I had quietly mastered. It wasn't planned. It happened naturally, like healing often does. One of them asked me once, "How did you stay so calm when people tried to take what was yours?" I smiled, because I knew what was mine couldn't be taken, only surrendered, and I stopped surrendering. I used to think legacy was about big gestures, money, fame, family lineage, but I've learned that legacy is also about presence. It's about the space you hold when you walk into a room without shrinking. The lives you influence simply by living yours with integrity. I didn't raise my voice to reclaim my dignity. I lived it, and others noticed, even strangers. I began getting messages from old friends, colleagues, distant cousins, saying they admired how balanced I seemed. If only they knew the storm I had quietly walked through. There's a photo that hangs now in my hallway. It's a black and white image of a door slightly ajar, with light spilling through the crack. I bought it at a local art fair. The artist said it symbolized transition, how sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones where you simply don't close the door behind you. You just leave, gently. That photo reminds me of the day I didn't shout, didn't slam anything, didn't make a speech. I just made a decision, and that decision changed everything. My apartment, once nearly hijacked, now feels like a sanctuary. The second bedroom is no longer symbolic, it's useful. Some evenings I sit in that reading chair and remember the furniture boxes labeled for a life that was never meant to be mine, and I'm grateful. Not bitter, grateful that they underestimated me, because their assumption became my awakening. I had spent years living quietly so others could be loud. Now I live fully and let the silence fall where it may. Sometimes I still hear about family events, birthdays, dinners. I'm always invited, but not expected, and that difference matters. I attend when I choose, stay when it feels right, and leave when I feel full. No guilt, no games, just choice. That, to me, is the final form of healing, not a clean break, but a clean mind, one that knows how to stay in a room without surrendering the soul. Because legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you refuse to lose in the first place. One evening, I received a letter, handwritten. My name was printed carefully on the envelope in my mother's script. For a brief moment, I held my breath. A part of me, some small, old, loyal piece, hoped it might be an apology, a true acknowledgement. I opened it slowly, savoring the moment in case it turned out to be that long-awaited balm. But it wasn't. It was vague. Sentimental, yes. It spoke of family ties and the misunderstandings that happen when emotions run high. Not once did it say the words I had wanted. I'm sorry. Not once did it name what had been done. I read it twice. The first time with hope, the second time with clarity. I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer, not to cherish, but to release. Because here's what I had finally come to understand. Closure doesn't come from the people who hurt you. It comes from the decision not to let their silence echo louder than your healing. The apology I needed wasn't a sentence, it was the life I had built in its absence. It's strange how emotional freedom isn't marked by fireworks, but by stillness. I realized I hadn't thought about their betrayal in weeks. It had become a chapter important, yes, but finished. The kind you close softly, not in anger, but in peace. And when you can walk past your pain without pausing to justify it, you know you've truly moved on. One afternoon, I hosted a small dinner at my place. A few friends, music, laughter. As we moved through the rooms, someone said, "Your place feels like a person, like it knows you." And I smiled, because it was true. Every corner had been shaped by the man I became, not the one I had been told to be. My home, like my life, finally fit me. That night, I sat alone for a moment. After everyone had left, the dishes undone, a half glass of wine still on the table, I looked around, not with pride, but with gratitude, because I had walked through something heavy, something quiet and almost invisible, and I had come out on the other side intact, scarred, yes, but not defined by it. The hurt didn't disappear, it just stopped holding the pen. I used to think justice required acknowledgement, but now I know sometimes justice is simply never needing their permission again, for space, for worth, for peace. And that in the end is the most powerful kind of revenge, a life so free it doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. There's something sacred about reaching the end of a story and realizing you were never the villain, never the weak one, never the problem. You were simply the only one who stopped pretending. That's what I've come to understand as I walk through the days now, not with a grudge in my chest, but with lightness in my step. Because this is what freedom feels like. Choosing your own name, your own path, your own worth, and never handing it over again. Sometimes I pass the park near my apartment, the one where my father used to meet me when I was in college, to talk about being responsible and doing the right thing for the family. I used to hang on every word. Now I walk by without pausing, because I no longer live in that script. I've stopped rewriting myself to fit someone else's story. My story is slower, quieter, but it's mine, and in that truth, there's power no one can touch. A few weeks ago, Ava's husband sent me a message. It was short. "You were right," he wrote. Just that. No context, no follow-up. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. That sentence wasn't for me. It was for him. A confession, perhaps. A realization. Maybe things in their world had started to crack without the scaffolding of my silent sacrifices. Maybe he finally saw the weight of what they'd done. Or maybe for the first time he recognized that strength doesn't always look like compliance. I used to think forgiveness meant letting people back in, but now I know better. Forgiveness is letting yourself move on, without waiting for the other person to notice they lost you. It's walking past what broke you without picking up the pieces. I've forgiven them, not because they earned it, but because I deserve peace. That's what makes it final. That's what makes it real. This story didn't end with confrontation or revenge. It ended with a door that stayed closed, with a life that grew silently beyond their reach. I still carry love for them in some way, but it's the kind of love you give from a distance, with strong fences and deeper roots. I send them light, but I don't send my presence. They taught me what it means to be erased. I taught myself how to reappear. My name is Jordan Ellis, and it was never theirs to reassign. Not to a moving truck, not to a nursery that wasn't mine, not to a role I didn't choose. I live on my own terms now, and for the first time, I don't feel like I'm surviving my life. I'm inhabiting it. Quietly, fully, completely.